Hello and welcome to Calm the Pharm podcast, where pharmacy business meets legal wisdom, minus the headache. In each episode, we share practical legal tips and real-life examples to help you run your pharmacy with confidence. I'm your host, Sarah Stoddart. Thanks very much for joining us. I get it. Buying a pharmacy is super exciting, and it's always a pleasure to be a part of that journey. Sometimes, though, pharmacists can do things in an effort to progress their matter quickly or help themselves at perhaps minimal costs, only to find out it's a problem when it's too late. The excitement and fear that pharmacists feel when they embark on a journey of owning a pharmacy begins long before the settlement date. Often it's the contract negotiation stages which cause the biggest roller coaster of emotions, but it doesn't have to be that way. By knowing what to avoid when you embark on the buying journey, you can feel more confident that you've got yourself the best buy and on the best terms, so you can be the best pharmacist you can be. Over the years, I've seen buyers make a number of mistakes when buying a pharmacy, but today we're going to talk about just 3 of them. The first is in relation to the structure. So the first mistake I see is using an existing or DIY structure. Having the right ownership structure is important for so many reasons, from liability to asset protection and, of course, tax benefits. Sometimes buyers have an existing company or a structure that they might have used for another business or which hasn't ever been used at all. Others choose to set up the structures themselves. Both options present risks, further costs, and potentially a future of financial issues. It's also worth mentioning that in the pharmacy industry, using a structure without actually looking at the documents which form part of that structure, such as the company constitution or the terms of a trust deed, can also cause headaches when you go to lodge your regulatory approval applications. That's because those documents need to be compliant with pharmacy ownership, and oftentimes, unless they've been prepared by a specialist in pharmacy, they aren't. If you're midway through a transaction, this means your transaction halts while you have to sort out your documents, and that causes time and, of course, the costs. So, from a legal perspective, using an existing structure is the first issue that we see, and that is where perhaps you might use the same structure that's set up for another business. That blurs the lines, and it blurs the lines between the two businesses, which can then create liability issues as well as a lack of protection for the owner in the event that one of the businesses face difficulties such as financial distress or legal proceedings. So what I mean by that is if you have a structure set up and you then use that same structure for another business, you're basically putting them into the same basket. So if one goes down, both will go down. There's no division, which will give you that layer of protection. As I mentioned earlier, pharmacists who set up their own structures without full appreciation and understanding of the ownership legislation, as well as financial and taxation consequences, also expose themselves to risks. So some instances as well, setting up structures incorrectly may result in having to restructure the asset, which also raises questions of stamp duty implications. So what's the solution to this structuring mistake that I see, be it using an existing structure or a DIY structure? Well, the solution is to engage your advisors early. Make sure they know the business that you're operating, and that is the space they work in, and have them set up the structure that is most appropriate for you and which is compliant with the relevant legislation. Although that does incur some costs, think of those costs as an insurance policy. In other words, a protection from future issues. The second issue or mistake that I see quite commonly is negotiating the offer yourself and not showing it to anyone until it's signed. I understand the pharmacy market is competitive and people like to keep things under wraps for as long as possible, but that doesn't mean excluding your inner circle or your team of trusted advisors from your negotiations. All too often, pharmacists start the buying journey by negotiating the offers themselves or in conjunction with the seller's broker. What's the problem with that, you ask? Well, the broker works for and is paid by the seller. So ultimately, they're going to look after the seller's interests before the buyer's. As friendly and helpful as the broker might be, they're not in the buyer's inner circle. You need to have someone involved in your circle whilst you're going through that process. And although the offer document might not be binding on the parties, it's important to get it right. Getting it right means less back and forth when you're negotiating the terms of the contract, and also make sure that everyone's on the same page from the get-go. Also, there might be certain things that us as lawyers know are going to come into negotiations or form part of the contract but are not dealt with in the offer. And the problem is, if they're not dealt with in the offer, you might find that when you go to say they need to be in the contract, the other side says, too bad, it wasn't in your offer document. So the risk there is that you might overlook important considerations or conditions. One of those is the right to interview employees. You might also leave out key details, such as the timeframe for satisfying key conditions. That, as I said, can make the contract negotiations more tedious when they need to be. So what's the solution to this one? Well, let your advisors into your inner circle only. Have them on board during the negotiation stage, and that's the negotiation stage of the offer, so that you can be confident that your offer contains all of the key details and timeframes for the purchase, so you can become the owner of the pharmacy sooner rather than later. The third issue that I see, and it's not really a mistake, it's just more of an issue, is getting fixated on the settlement date. Of course, dates are important, and the consequences for missing a key date can be serious and costly. However, when it comes to pharmacy transactions, settlement dates need to be fluid. They can and often do change. And whilst almost all pharmacy contracts get there in the end, we can't get fixated on a date because it is, as I said, a moving date. Most pharmacy contracts are conditional on something which involves a third party. So that might be the landlord consenting to the assignment of the lease or a new lease. It might be your regulatory approvals. Of course, they often include banks as well. When you involve third parties in a transaction who are not bound by the terms of the contract and who are also not concerned with your timeframes, but who play a very important part in getting the contract over the line, it means that the parties need to be flexible. Oftentimes, the settlement date is extended while you're waiting for the landlord to get back to you or your regulatory approval to go through. So getting fixated on the settlement date will likely end in disappointment because the date moves while the parties wait for those final pieces of puzzle to come together. I often say to people, provided that the parties remain on the same page and focused on the common goal, which is settlement, settlement will happen when it happens. We also often recommend that settlement date not be a fixed date in a contract, but rather the later of a set amount of dates or perhaps a number of days after the last condition is satisfied. That provides that ability to be fluid without the need to be constantly getting extensions. So what's the solution or what's the advice on this issue? Well, have an end date in mind, but be prepared to be flexible. Keep your goal, keep focused, do all that you can, and where possible, have, as I said, that settlement date not as a fixed date, but rather as a date based on the occurrence of other events. I promise it'll get there, it just takes time and patience.